Welcome to the show, everyone. It's the Crypto Lark. Today, I got the chance to sit down with Matthew Spoke from Aion. Matthew, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Now, for anybody who isn't familiar with the project yet, can you give us the short version?
Sure. Yeah. Aion's a blockchain protocol that we're developing that focuses essentially on interoperability and scaling of blockchain applications. So, generally what that means is we're building a public network that allows you to connect different blockchains to each other and build applications that can kind of traverse from one network to another, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Now, this is being billed as a third generation blockchain. So what defines a blockchain as being a third generation?
Well, I guess the way we used to think about it, and to be honest, we're kind of rethinking the messaging because we're trying more and more to talk to the mainstream world outside the crypto space, and to them, they don't know what a blockchain is, let alone a first or second or third generation. So we're trying to think of the more like the more concise way to tell people what we're building. But third generation kind of came from the idea that first generation networks were Bitcoin style networks that were very singularly focused on tokens of value moving from A to B in a peer-to-peer transaction. Second generations networks were like the Ethereum style blockchain where you could start to build logic on chain and start to run essentially more complex processes around the movement of those assets. So you could write rules around when and how to move assets based on what we came to call smart contracts. And then this third layer of infrastructure for us was if you have all of these various isolated systems, then the connecting fabric that brings them all together was the third generation of infrastructure that we thought had yet to be built. So it's really connecting the dots. If you think of every blockchain as being like an isolated network that has not yet had the means to talk to each other yet. So that's what we've been focusing on.
I feel like interoperability is one of those holy grails for cryptocurrencies because they're all islands right now and there's no bridges between any of the islands, and that's really problematic when you want to transfer value from one chain to another, let alone, of course, transferring logic via smart contracts cross-chain. That's a different conversation, I suppose, but why do you see interoperability as being so important, and then how exactly are you approaching this interoperability?
Yeah, I think you kind of said it well. I mean, interoperability is what changes this industry from being a fragmented series of many technologies to a single network that kind of changes the way we govern online businesses and industries. And right now, if you use the analogy of the internet, we're not at the stage of the internet yet. We're at the stage of multiple isolated networks that have not been interconnected to each other. And that's why you often hear in this concept of interoperability, people use terms like the Internet of Blockchains or Web 3.0 or those types of things. And it really comes down to this will only be analogous to the internet when it all acts and looks and feels like a single network. That single network might be built up of subcomponents that are built on different protocols. You may have a sub network inside this giant internet that is Ethereum, and a sub network that is Bitcoin, and a sub network that is quantum, or whatever that list becomes. But the internet analogy will be when they all start communicating with each other, so that from the user's perspective, it doesn't matter where your transaction is getting processed or where your assets are being stored. You just have confidence that the underlying protocols are all functioning kind of together, and that's where we think there's still a big gap right now. One of the analogies that people often point to is like the development of mobile applications. And over time, mobile applications used to be very specific to a single underlying hardware or underlying protocol. You'd build like a BlackBerry application, or even before that, you'd build like a Palm OS application for the Palm Pilot era. And they were very, very kind of tied to a single technology stack. Over time, we started seeing that people were obfuscating more and more and more. And to the point today where you have a unique function in like Android, for example, that runs on multiple hardwares, where you can build an application that runs the same way in different environments. And even more so, you're seeing a lot of new mobile applications get built on web technologies instead of mobile technologies, because web technologies are browser based, and it doesn't matter if you open that browser on an iPhone or an Android, it's still the same browser interface. So if I can build an app inside that. So we're kind of seeing the same trend. We want to see applications get built in such a way that they don't have to attach themselves to a single blockchain protocol. So that you're not an Ethereum app or a Bitcoin app or a quantum app or an EOS app. Eventually, you're just a decentralized app. And that means you're decentralized from any one protocol, you're decentralized from access to any one currency. And that is what truly, you know, decentralized apps should look like in the future. But it's going to take us time to get through that progression.
That's really cool. And you said it so well, but it's the situation where we need to see the blockchains operating in such a way that people don't even realize they're using blockchain, much like people don't realize they're using a lot of the different things they're using when they access the internet today. It needs to be a seamless user experience. The cryptographic addresses and things that we're using now are not as user-friendly as we would like them to be by any means, so it's going to be very interesting seeing how this develops moving forward. But what are the challenges for Aion to talk to a diverse range of blockchains? They all kind of speak different languages to an extent. You have NEM, you have NEO, you have Cardano, you have, I don't know, Digibyte, and all these different blockchains.
Yeah.
What are the challenges in actually getting this interconnectivity going on?
Well, I guess, you know, technically, I'll walk through that in a second, but like before we get into the technical design, I think the biggest challenge is knowing which one is worth building a connection to. Right? Like, there's so many out there that I think are gaining prominence today that may exist in 2 years and may not exist in 2 years, right? This market landscape is going to change so many times in the next few years that it's really difficult. And this is where I feel for the app developer in this market to know, you know, why would I build anywhere other than Ethereum that has this future promise, but I don't know if it's actually going to gain any traction. I don't know if there's going to be adoption around that network. And I might essentially put tons and tons of effort to develop something specifically for NEO just to find out that, you know, a couple of years down the road, that protocol doesn't exist anymore, just as an example, you know. So that's a big challenge because everybody wants to know who's the winners and losers. And we tend to have, you know, the hypothesis that there should be several protocols at the end of the day. Many of them are built with very different functions, right? Some are built for small devices, high transaction throughput, you know, smart contracts, no smart contracts. Bitcoin and Ethereum have very different value propositions. So we do think there's room for multiple protocols. And then identifying which one of those protocols we want to essentially become compatible to is kind of where our design comes in. And the Aion design is very specifically it was very specifically designed to require little to no adjustment on the protocol that we connect to. So we didn't want to require people to fork into our design or, you know, design compatibility of Aion directly into their own protocols, because that starts to, it's overly assumptive as to what people are willing to do to connect with us. So it needed to be very, very light touch, where, like you said, each one of these blockchain protocols essentially speaks its own language, meaning the mechanism of consensus and the way they process transactions and the way messages are sent and received by nodes is all slightly different from one protocol to the other. So for us, the interpretation layer, if you think these things are languages, then Aion is the interpreter of those languages. That interpretation layer needs to be able to understand different frameworks, right? So we need to be able to build it in such a way that I can understand the format of a transaction on Bitcoin, transmit that in such a way that an Ethereum smart contract would understand it. So we have something in our design called our multi-chain framework, or MCF. If people are on our GitHub, you'll find kind of a repository about the multi-chain framework. And the long-term design around that framework is that within an Aion node, you can run essentially compatibility to different protocols. So you can understand Bitcoin and you can understand Ethereum and you can understand Cardano, and whatever that list becomes, you know, we'll broaden the way that our multi-chain framework is designed to capture as many as possible. So that when you're running a node on what we call bridges in the Aion design, that node is essentially speaking two languages. It's speaking the language of the two blockchains that it's connecting to. And then it's essentially using a micro consensus process on the bridge to make sure that everybody else who's speaking those same two languages is aligned on the interpretation, right? So I saw a transaction on Ethereum and I want to transmit it to Aion. So I want to make sure that everybody's in agreement as to what that transaction was, et cetera. So that's where the multi-chain framework fits in, is how do you run a node that is essentially running on two parallel blockchains at the same time.
Awesome. That is a really good description of how it works. And I think it just kind of lays it down a bit technically, but also in layman's terms, it lets kind of understand, you know, a nice simple interpretation of it.
What you said earlier really resonates with me. I always joke that we'll know that the industry has become successful when blockchains are really boring, when nobody wants to talk about them anymore. This is kind of like nobody has these cool online conversations about databases. It's just not a really interesting thing. Eventually, we want this to be so far removed from the average person's life, nobody will tune in for a blockchain conversation in 3 years, hopefully, and then we'll have succeeded.
Strange times indeed. It's strange times indeed. Yeah. Now, currently, you guys are hitting around 52 transactions per second, I think, is what I saw recently on Twitter. can you confirm that? And also, can you kind of follow up with what do you think really is the best way to be scaling blockchains? Is it sharding? Is it off-chain scaling solutions?
Sure. Yeah. And I think it's a combination of many things. But so on the transaction kind of processing that we've been doing, we've been in our test net for a few months, going through different iterations of the test net. A big focus has been pressure testing for throughput and data and, you know, all sorts of just different vectors to make sure that it can withstand a certain amount of stress. We realized that when we launched the mainnet, you know, the actual usage will probably not on day one be at the same level as like the maximum stress testing that we were doing over the last few weeks. So people may have seen that we've pushed the network upwards of 4.5 million. I think we've been testing more recently. We've been talking about pushing tests up to 5 or 6 million transactions a day. We don't talk too much about like individual, you know, transaction per second statistics on the network, because I think what gets lost often in the conversation is how do you calculate a transaction per second and what are the variables that go into that. It's very easy to throw around, you know, apples and oranges comparisons. Like if somebody says, hey, I ran a single node of a single technology on my one supercomputer and I was able to do 10 million transactions. That's not the same as running a node inside a truly global network where there's different bottlenecks and latencies that emerge. So often the comparisons you hear in the industry about performance are not really apples to apples comparisons. And even, you know, more pronounced than that is we tend to think that there's a lot of solutions that are trading off decentralization for performance. So often the better the transaction throughput, in fact, we see that as a negative because we just assume and, you know, sometimes confirm when we go digging into the weeds of their technology that they've prioritize performance at the expense of decentralization or at the expense of something else that's really critical to the design of the system. And over time, you know, our perspective is if you can get the fundamentals right of a decentralized, scalable solution, performance will optimize naturally over time. Just the way, you know, computation has gotten stronger over time, it'll be the same thing in the blockchain. So to try to design today for absolute performance, we think is premature because we think it'll happen. It'll just naturally happen in due course as these technologies kind of evolve. What we have been focusing on as a solution for scaling is we think scaling eventually will happen over multiple chains. And then, you know, the critical bottleneck is how do you move messages between chains? So instead of saying, you know, how do I get a single chain up to millions of transactions per second? How do I get many chains to seamlessly interact with each other? So from the user's perspective, it can do millions of transactions per second. But you might only have on one chain hundreds of thousands or hundreds of transactions per second, depending on the designs of those chains. You know, Bitcoin, there's very good reasons that it's a pretty restricted transaction per second system. And that does not mean it's a disadvantage. In fact, that's led to a huge amount of value occurring in the Bitcoin system. It's one of the most inefficient blockchains that currently operates in our market, yet it's the most valuable, right? So these things should not be seen as like directly correlated to each other. But all of these solutions that you mentioned, you know, I think there's on-chain scaling solutions. There's going to be, you know, solutions like sharding and state channels. The plasma design is really interesting to us that Ethereum is working on. Many of those work on the assumption of a single protocol, though, right? So if you have sharding of the Ethereum protocol, it means you're operating many shards of Ethereum, or Plasma means you're operating many Ethereum protocol networks that all kind of like stack on top of each other. State channels are very specific to a single blockchain design. So those are what, you know, most of these we'd consider level 2 scaling solutions. We talk about Aion as being kind of a level 3 scaling solution. Level 3 meaning connecting different protocols to each other. So not just a solution about a single network. So Lightning, for example, is a good level 2 protocol on top of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin and Lightning. Same thing with sharding on top of Ethereum. So level 3 is when we take it one level farther removed and we say, well, I want to scale between Bitcoin and Ethereum. And, you know, that's not something that sharding solves for or something, you know, Lightning solves for example. So that's where you need a new layer of solutions. And that's where there's a few projects focusing, you know, projects like Cosmos, projects like Polkadot, that are really focusing on, you know, this inter-protocol scaling rather than single protocol scaling.
It's such an interesting concept because it's like you said, we all think about scaling and we're all trying to drive 1 million cars across one tiny bridge, right? But why not just build a few more bridges to ease the burden, right? And it's really interesting because I definitely see this future where there's going to be thousands, perhaps millions of blockchains if we start to account for all the different ones that are be happening privately in businesses and all these things. So this database infrastructure that's being built is going to be massive beyond belief. And like you said, if they
Well,
can
the other
talk to
thing
each
is, like,
other.
you know, your like transportation analogy is like, yeah, you could build super highways and everybody could drive at, you know, 150 kilometers an hour. But some people might want to take the subway to work and some people might want to bike to work. And there's different, you know, transportation is a very multifaceted analogy. And I think it kind of fits because you look at solutions like EOS, for example, where the entire premise of their scaling solution is that the nodes on their network are going to be supercomputers, essentially. And you're going to have a small number of somewhat centralized supercomputers that allow for massive transaction throughput. That comes at a massive trade-off to decentralization and to some of the other characteristics that we like about these decentralized technologies. And not to say that there's not a solution for that, but we have to recognize these things for what they are. You're going to operate along a spectrum of very centralized solutions to very decentralized solutions. And everywhere along that spectrum will come different pros and cons of the designs of these systems. And they all can coexist. It doesn't have to be a single one to win them all. And that's, you know, we try to not be too hostile in our messaging. We never talk about Aion instead of another protocol. It's, to us, it's all a matter of realizing that there's probably room for many of these different designs to fit in the market in the future. And then it's just a matter of finding a generic enough way for them to send messages between each other.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned a few partners that you have, but I want to really focus in on a particularly exciting Interoperability Alliance that you're a member of. So Icon, WanChain, and Aion are all part of the Interoperability Alliance. So what can we expect from that? What is the intention of this alliance, and how are you finding ways to cooperate together?
Yeah, we've been so most recently I was with Dustin Byington and the team at Icon in Hangzhou, China, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, talking about kind of our next steps, road mapping what we want to accomplish together. I mean, early days, what it's meant for us is we've essentially established a trusted environment for us to just share knowledge, you know, and part of it is there's still some hostility and competitiveness in this market. So we wanted to identify a couple of friendly projects that we felt very, very comfortable telling them what we're working on and asking them what they're working on, kind of behind closed doors, the stuff that hasn't yet hit the public domain, so that we can maybe skip a couple of steps of trial and error to the extent that we're all trying the same things, and, you know, we can learn from each other's experiments. So right now it's really been, you know, I'd say a platform through which our engineering teams can feel comfortable sharing knowledge as if they're part of the same team. So, you know, we learn from each other's designs and approaches, and the hope is that it can make us each individually more efficient as we try to achieve our goals, because we'll learn stuff from each other's engineering teams. And to date, it's been great. I mean, we've learned a lot, just, you know, getting closer looks into what Icon and WanChain are building. The goal, of course, is that we'd start to open up that platform for more companies to join us and more projects to join us, because I think there's a lot of new projects joining this interoperability space that all have, you know, a unique take on how to solve for this problem. And at this stage, we're all working on hypotheses, and none of us have really proven those hypotheses yet. So to the extent we can run multiple hypotheses in parallel, I think we all get a solution to market faster. That's our motivation. The goal for the next few months with the Interoperability Alliance is really to get the cadence of those knowledge sharing meetings kind of on a more you know, recurring basis, so that we have kind of every couple of weeks our engineering teams kind of catching up with each other, identifying opportunities to, you know, test each other's code and each other's implementations, and then, you know, hopefully what we would do is start to look at how do we do integrations between our mainnet designs, so we can run, you know, a bridge between the WanChain system and the Aion system and the Icon Nexus, et cetera. So that's, you know, intended on the roadmap as well. We're gonna be spending some time together in May, where Icon and WanChain are both coming to the Aion X conference cool. in Toronto. So we'll be doing a little kind of roundtable panel discussion there. And then we're also hosting an event together at Consensus in New York. So part of that is to bring other potential members to the table. We want to start essentially spending time with other projects that have something to offer. We've kept the focus very much at the protocol layer. So we're not so much talking about projects that are building apps that would leverage interoperability, but we're talking about projects that are solving for interoperability inside the infrastructure of their systems. And so there are a couple of really, really cool kind of shortlisted projects that we've opened conversations with. And yeah, I think at some point in the future, and we don't want to rush this, the group can eventually evolve into like a standards organization. But I think standards need to follow adoption. And so to force standards before we've really proven which model gets the most adoption, I think is a little premature. So right now, it really just is kind of a structured way to experiment with each other.
Wow, that's really cool. I think there's so much possibility in that, and I love the collaborative, just attitude of the whole thing, the ethos behind it. Hey, we're all trying to talk to each other. Why not sit down and talk to each other so that our blockchains can talk to each other instead of just, being all off in our separate rooms saying, we're going to talk to the other blockchains someday. So I really like this idea. It's really cool. Now, you've got some other great partners as well. For example, can you tell me a bit about your partnership with Bancor?
Sure. Yeah, I just came back last week. I just came back from Tel Aviv. Had a great event with Bancor. They've been building a really cool system, and I think especially over the last couple of months, they've been demonstrating an enormous amount of traction around the Bancor system, around how do you build liquidity pools between two different asset classes that can trade against each other without any centralized friction. Their goal is to be able to provide that type of system on top of many networks. So one of our early experiments with them is how do you run Bancor on top of Aion? And then eventually, how do you connect Bancor as it sits on many blockchains all to each other? So you can have the Bancor, and I think there's going to be an ongoing trend that we see with more projects. And in fact, I had this conversation with the CEO of Kyber Network just 2 weeks ago when we were in Tokyo together. Is a lot of these applications, they launched on top of Ethereum because it essentially today is 95% of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. But over time, they see more and more diversification popping up, and that means as an app, you want to make sure that your functionality can kind of traverse from one network to the other. So building parallel implementations of Bancor on Ethereum, Bancor on Aion, and eventually using our bridging technology to be able to connect those. That's what we hope to do with them. And then in the shorter term, we've launched obviously the Aion coin on top of the Bancor network so that people can get access and kind of test out what Bancor has been building. But they've got an enormous amount of interesting kind of second layer applications and how do you build interesting financial tools on top of the Bancor system. So we had a really great meeting with them while we were in Tel Aviv, and I think there's lots more opportunity for us to test some stuff. Their engineering team is kind of second to none in Tel Aviv. We were really blown away by that community.
Nice. Yeah, you're definitely finding yourself at the center of all these, really great partners, which I think says so much about the Aion project overall, that so many people want to sit down and talk to you and work on how to make things talk, how to make this communication happen, which is really fantastic. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit here. You are a board member of the Entreprise Ethereum Alliance. So what exactly do you do in your role as a board member there? And expanding on that a little bit, what do you see as being really the necessary steps to get more enterprises involved in blockchain?
Yeah, good question. So my role in the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance kind of comes from, the original focus of our company, Nuco, before we launched the Ant project, was building enterprise infrastructure. So we were primarily doing Ethereum implementations using private consensus algorithms to be able to do private networks for banks and governments and, a lot of these kind of enterprise domains. And what we realized early on was that there was many projects working on similar layers of infrastructure, and we're all doing it slightly differently from each other. So we kind of came together in late 2016 to launch the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance in February of 2017. There's 11 of us on the board of directors, of which 3 are startups, us and a company called Block Apps, good friends of ours, and Consensus, which many people are familiar with. Mm-hmm. And then the other 8 are large institutions, Microsoft and Accenture and Intel, JP Morgan, and a few others. And the intent was always to start talking about standardization of using the Ethereum protocol as an enterprise technology. Lots of infrastructure that needs to be built for that to be possible long term. Because in the enterprise context, most of these use cases have dramatically high security requirements, privacy requirements, performance requirements, and a lot of these things were just not inherent in the out of the box open source designs that people were building in the public domain. So starting to prioritize characteristics and features for enterprise users. So my role in the board of directors today is much more on the governance side. It's our team and the technology that we're building with Aion is not directly relevant to the enterprise roadmap that we're working on at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So I still sit on the board for governance. That means meetings every couple of weeks, a lot of administrative stuff, unfortunately, and always trying to grow the group. And growing the group, I think we're coming up on 500 members.
Wow.
Yeah, it's massive. And I mean, and the big focus has been on spreading the message of why enterprises, as you said, should be taking this technology more seriously. And the easiest on-ramp was to get them into the Ethereum ecosystem, right? It's an easy place for enterprise engineers and developers to start testing their ideas and running proof of concepts. And to the extent we can structure that a little bit more effectively, then it's a benefit to them and it's a benefit to us. It's turning into kind of a spec on how do you run a private Ethereum network, and that spec is something that we're getting ready to release publicly in the next couple of months as the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So it'll be like, if you want to run an Enterprise Ethereum implementation, here's how it might be built, and here's the architecture, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of technical work that's gone into that. The EEA has hired its own technical staff to kind of put that work together. Really, really great team. Longer term, though, as when I think about the enterprise market, I think what's often been missing from these conversations over the last couple of years is that we think about the enterprise blockchain market as being incumbent non-blockchain companies adopting blockchain technology, which is absolutely an important bucket. But I think equally important is realizing that there's a whole new wave of enterprises getting built right now, right? Like when you think about, you don't talk about the internet enterprises, because these are companies that were born in the internet era. They weren't predecessors that adopted the internet. It's companies like Google and Amazon that became the dominant companies of their era.
They came to represent the internet.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be different for us because we don't expect massive monopolies to get built, because it's kind of contrary to the ethos of a decentralized ecosystem. But we do think that there will be significant enterprises that emerge out of these new companies building in the blockchain space. And so if they become the enterprise of the future, then a lot of it comes down to how do you get, that's the enterprise alliance that I'm more focused on. I love the idea of banks testing this technology and governments, but it's only half the equation. The other half is who are these new companies getting built. But there will be more to come on the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance in the next few months. We're going to be doing a decent amount of discussions and talks at Consensus in New York on the week of May 14th. So people can stay tuned for that.
Yeah, really cool. There's definitely just so much happening, and we're here, we see it all the time, all of these new blockchain startups, new blockchains, new ways of approaching scaling, new ideas for languages, and all these different things keep coming out, and those are going to be powerful. Those are going to be big. These are going to be household names to the extent that, they will be in a few years. Now, recently, you were in Africa, which is really interesting. What were your impressions of the community in Africa? What were the sort of responses about building blockchain-based projects and how that can help their businesses?
Yeah, so we spent some time in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Nairobi back in March. I was fascinated. I mean, I think we first went down. There was a conference in Johannesburg called Blockchain Africa, which brought together a lot of really interesting companies from across the continent. But more specifically, when we did like developer events in those three cities, I found that there was an enormous amount of software development skill set there, and it's, the more we go into developing economies, the more we realize that the appetite is significantly more urgent. For them, it's a matter of building an infrastructure not to replace an old one, but to build it for the first time. In many cases, right? Like a financial infrastructure that is truly inclusive, and an identity infrastructure that does not rely on, unstable governments and these types of things that are significantly more urgent in places around the world where there's just less, there's less incumbent infrastructure to kind of rely on. So I was extremely, encouraged by the types of people we met. We have a good growing community in Nairobi now that we're still dealing with pretty regularly around how to get more kind of applications and stuff built on Aion out of Nairobi. We did some really interesting events with a company called Andela, and the cool story behind Andela is across the continent they employ about 900 software developers today, and they're funded in part by the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. And it's this whole new wave of like, how do you educate for the new economy in Africa, and focused on software development as a skill set. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it's this idea of leapfrogging infrastructures in the developed world, where the developing world doesn't have some of these constraints, right? They don't have some of the things that slow us down when we're operating out of Canada or the US or Western Europe or New Zealand. Skipping the landline era to adopt mobile telephones is something that's like an obvious analogy. And I think blockchains are gonna have a similar path to market, where you're already starting to see that technologies like Bitcoin are significantly more adopted in places around the world where financial infrastructure is lacking. And I think it'll be very true of other decentralized technologies. So we're very optimistic about the work that we're going to do as the Aion Foundation in Africa. Hopefully get involved in some cool grassroots projects that really show some of the value in less developed economies.
Wow, it's it's just so cool when you think about the ability of all this blockchain technology, just jump right over, you know, and
Yeah.
the phone analogy is perfect. And, you know, I've been talking to a lot of people and they're all saying kind of similar things. There's so much opportunity in, you know, Southeast Asia and sub-Saharan Africa and on and on and on to really just go straight to the next thing. And it's great to see it. There's a lot of enthusiasm for building on Aion as well, which is really cool. Now, final question for you for today. What can we expect from Aion this year? What are the big milestones that we're looking forward to?
So, I mean, a couple of things. Obviously, we're getting ready to launch the first version of our mainnet. I think there's been a decent amount of anticipation around that. And then, you know, beyond that, I kind of summarized the two focuses that we have at the Aion Foundation is kind of research and development of the protocol, and then encouraging adoption among our ecosystem, right? So, and growing of that ecosystem. So, you know, big focus for us is how do we get more people aware of what we're doing and building on top of what we're doing. So, that continues to be the strategy for the rest of the year. We'll continue to do developer meetups, continue to appear at the right conferences to get the message out there. And now that we've gotten, you know, a significant amount of our tech built, we're a lot more, we feel like we're in a better position now to start kind of telling the world about it. What we didn't want to do, you know, earlier this year or late last year was get too far ahead of ourselves with a lot of marketing before the substance was really ready to put in the market. So we're kind of getting more comfortable now. We're going to be spending a lot of time supporting projects that are going to be building applications on top of the Aion network, building tools, migrating tools from other ecosystems into ours, just to really round out all the functional requirements that people might have if they want to build something with Aion. You know, structurally, what we're in the process of doing, we've been talking a long time about the Aion Foundation. The Aion Foundation is kind of becoming a formal entity. The Aion Foundation is going to be governed in what we think is a significantly more appropriate way for the industry as we move forward. So we've been moving more towards kind of a nonprofit research and development model because of the fact that we see our most important stakeholders being the user of our technology, not a group of shareholders or owners, as is traditionally the case in software companies. So we're realigning our governance and our operating structure towards the Aion Foundation. And then in parallel to the Aion Foundation, we're going to be supporting a community fund that's going to get built to invest in projects that are going to be building on top of Aion, either nonprofit investments, you know, through grants and bounties for people that are doing kind of core infrastructure that's not necessarily monetizable. Or there will also be a for-profit investment arm for people that are building kind of applications and business things on top of the Aion network. So those will all be, you know, forthcoming in the next few months.
Wow, lots of exciting things happening over at Aion.
Yeah,
we'll certainly be, you know, watching with anticipation to see what comes up next. And I just love the idea of the community fund to help these projects come to your blockchain. So very cool stuff. Awesome, Matthew. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today. This has been a really interesting chat. So thanks for sharing your insights.
Yeah, appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. We'll do another update when there's more to talk about.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Thank you.